And a good day and welcome to the CNBC Africa Conversation. My name is Tanya Habimana and I'm going to be your host for the next plus minus 30 minutes. 3 words: connection, facilitation and acceleration are key for any business looking to expand to other regions or even continents. These are not easily achieved but well worth the effort. I'm now joined by Potgieter, the chairman of the South African Business Council, an entity that does just that for companies in South Africa looking to establish a footprint in Dubai. So Paul, I want to start off by understanding just how big this transaction or flow is. I mean, when we're talking businesses, South African businesses going into Dubai, how many are there?
Well, first of all, you need to think about the trade flows between the two countries. And it's maybe worthwhile to go all the way back to 1994. That's when it all started. So in 1994, the commercial agreement between the UAE and South Africa was essentially commercialized. And that opened the doors for trade between the two regions. Fast forward about 3 decades later, and we, in 2019, structured the highest record of growth between the two countries, which was about 54 billion rand of bilateral trade. So that's really phenomenal record. In 2020 and 2021, with COVID, we had some impact, but 21 was again a recovery year, and we back to those levels that we had in 2019. And 2022 is on track to be another record year. So it's phenomenal bilateral relationships, which then helps us to really get to those record trade volumes. In terms of the quantity of businesses, I guess the other big story is not only the absolute number of value of trade, but also the basket. Look at that trade basket today. It was traditionally really based on some key metals like gold and also commodities like diamonds. That was the main core trade volume. But today, you see that basket actually increasing. So you've got more services, you've got more manufacturing products. And that's a great story for South Africans because you see entrepreneurs and other entities and institutions partaking in this value creation between the UAE and South Africa. And today we've got over 20,000 registered businesses between South Africa and the UAE. So it is really a growth story, not only from a trade volume perspective, but also in terms of the width and the diversity of that trade.
So what's it been like since COVID, actually? Because you mentioned a few record years, one of which was 2019. How has COVID impacted the trade flows between South Africa and the UAE?
Well, look, I guess that if you look at the trade flows in terms of COVID specifically, it is critical to understand that I still need to get an entrepreneur or a CEO that has not been exemplary in terms of the feedback of the UAE's vision and their leadership through the COVID process. It's just been extraordinary how great the governance and the leadership has been in terms of responding to COVID and then ultimately the core recovery after COVID. So, the great impact, I would say there's 2 main things that the leadership in the UAE did in aspect of COVID specifically. That was mainly around the corporate law additions, the reform in terms of corporate law, and then secondly, the visa reforms. Now, let's start with the corporate law. It's critical to understand that in 1994, the common law was accepted in the UAE. And this is really a pioneering landscape because at that stage, Sharia law was still the main fundamental federal law that was used in the UAE. So the acceptance of common law helped businesses to truly exceptionally starting up and seeing Dubai and the UAE as a place where they can operate. So since then, you've seen multiple modernizations of that law. The latest one was just after COVID, where as part of that corporate law, they allowed 100% foreign ownership. So that's a fundamental leap in terms of what they had before, where you had to have a local shareholder or local equity holder as part of your business. Today, you can have 100% ownership as an entrepreneur or an enterprise, and that really is helping businesses and increasing businesses to set up in the region. The other big fundamental component around that corporate law is also the way that this new law introduces new corporate vehicles. So this new law helps us to really drive concepts around special purpose vehicles. These are corporate structures, and it's helping Dubai to really establish new corporate structures where these businesses will have an easier path to either go to an IPO or to attract foreign direct investment. And as a consequence, you can see the numbers. I mean, Dubai in 2021 was ranked as the largest country, or the first country attracting the largest FDI in the world. So this is absolutely phenomenal if you think about how corporate law and the leniency in terms of how the UAE is pioneering on this front is helping businesses to do more business. And the last portion there, which I mentioned, is the visa regulation. Within COVID and after COVID, the UAE recognized that to attract talent and to keep talent, they need to refocus and reform the visa policies. So what you've seen is the introduction of multiple golden visa, green visa schemes, which are at a cornerstone focused on getting talent and keeping talent in the main region. And this is, once again, just another example of how they're modernizing and how they're thinking about not only the short term, but the longer term type of value creation that's really required for entrepreneurs and enterprises to flourish in the region.
And I want to come back to some of those points that you mentioned, particularly the corporate vehicles. I also know that the fact that within the law, or let's say within the corporate operations, the move from the weekend that used to be, if I'm not mistaken, on a Thursday and a Friday, moving to a Saturday and a Sunday, as similar to what the most of the rest of the world has had an impact. But before we get to that, I want to know a little bit more about the profile of the South African entrepreneur or business that is going to Dubai. What are some of the particularities?
Well, I guess if you look at the profile of South African businesses setting up in the UAE, it's probably no different to any other nationality. The UAE is an optimal destination because of the geographics. I mean, geographically, it's centered in this market where you've got access to the GCC, you've got access to Africa through Egypt, and you've got access to Asian markets, which is also closely knitted and have trade partners and bilateral trade agreements between the UAE. So when entrepreneurs set up in the UAE, they really are thinking about the total addressable market that they've got access to. And once again, GCC alone, you're talking about over $1.3 trillion. And then throw in Egypt, throw in India, and you're really looking at an entrepreneur where they've got access to a critical addressable market. Over and above that, supply chains and value chains are becoming such a critical, fundamental catalyst for these entrepreneurs and enterprises setting up in the UAE. Once again, you've got access from a logistical value chain point of view to multiple aspects of product development, multiple aspects of manufacturing, and then shipping your product or your service, obviously, to those different markets. I guess the other big thing that we typically get from CEOs and boards when they come set up is really the ease of doing business. The UAE regularly ranks in the top 5 in terms of ease of doing business. So the nation is really set up from an infrastructure perspective to allow entrepreneurs and enterprises to focus on their business. So you've got a world-class infrastructure, energy, safety, political systems. These are all fundamentals that help entrepreneurs to focus on what they need to do. And then more importantly, to operationalize quickly is also really effortless. So the UAE has been, from a government perspective, exceptionally supportive in helping businesses to quickly set up and really helping them to operationalize quickly. So think about the legal and the commercialization of a business, which typically is a very taxing thing to do. Here they've really thought about that value chain, and they've institutionalized that to some degree to make it easier. I guess the two final other points that we hear a lot of and that we get a lot of feedback on is the access to skill and labor. You've got access to a very wide spectrum of labor. May it be specialization or generalized labor that you require. So, there, if you look at the demographics, again, it's very wide and very deep. So it allows really entrepreneurs to tap into that type of differentiator. And ultimately, it all culminates into some social and political stability that all businesses are looking for. So the context, the environment that they have in the UAE really helps to amplify them focusing on what they do best. And that's to create value with the products or the services that they need to ultimately take to market.
Now, one reason that we have heard a lot for businesses looking to go into the UAE and Dubai specifically is that of taxation and the preferential taxation statuses that business owners can have. Is this still the case?
Well, The UAE has always been a low taxation country. From a corporate perspective, there has been no corporate tax, and then from a income tax perspective, there remains no income tax. But from 2018, you started to see the UAE government introducing some reform from a tax perspective. And 2018 was the first year that you saw VAT being introduced. So there was a 5% VAT that companies could start adding on to their products and services. And from 2023, there will be an introduction of corporate tax. Now, the UAE still remains one of the lowest tax regions in the GCC. So the corporate tax will around be 9%. But I guess the other takeaway is not only the 9% corporate tax, it's the fact that the UAE is getting ready to globalize even more. So as you see these different corporate structures being introduced and the modernization of tax laws coming into fruition as well, all these factors are leading indicators that the government is ultimately introducing more modernized process and protocols to allow for more foreign direct investment to ultimately come into the country.
Is this where we see innovations or projects such as Media City and the drive towards attracting more digital businesses into Dubai?
Well, yes, Dubai has been phenomenal in terms of being digitally ready, and they're attracting a lot of digitally focused capital coming into the city itself. And that's mainly because of two forces. I mean, first of all, you need to look at government once again. Government is spearheading a lot of incubation and accelerating centers to allow startups to truly scale up. And the one fundamental thing here is that these companies are digital-first companies. Their product and their services mix is really focused on digital services. Mm-hmm. The other part that you also see besides government is the fact that there's a lot of foreign direct investment coming into Dubai. And we talked about it a bit earlier. But this is truly something that needs to be solidified, is that Dubai is attracting the most foreign direct investment in 2021 in the world. That is mainly coming from the US and is mainly going into technology services. So, the UAE and Dubai specifically are betting big on advanced technology. And if you look at why that bet is so big, it's once again the B2C type of businesses rely on digital technologies to change that client journey and the way that end consumers are essentially buying products. And B2B companies are ultimately, once again, looking at their addressable market and some of the fundamentals that they can operate in the region. So both these two dynamics is really elevating the digital narrative in the region. And, at the epicenter, Dubai is spearheading the pioneership around blockchain, Web3 technologies. And we effectively, later in 2022, in November, we'll have the Blockchain Global Summit here in Dubai. And all of this is governed by the digital government to ensure that we ultimately get these businesses to be more digitally focused to ultimately deliver a more digital economy.
Now, Paul, that's a lot of positives there, but real talk. Tell me about some of the challenges and the obstacles that South African companies are experiencing when trying to set up in Dubai.
Well, there's many. I guess if you look at some of the challenges, often you've got different emirates across the UAE. And most of these entrepreneurs and enterprises need to reflect on what is the best emirate for the business service or the business that they ultimately want to operate in. Each of these different emirates really provide a different value proposition. Now, we have spoken a lot about Dubai, and Dubai is probably top on the list when it comes to a business that is digitally focused, that is focused on manufacturing of advanced technology, or is focused on the big industries that Dubai is going after, which is health, science, and also logistics. But there's also 6 other emirates, and these emirates are all competing and differentiating and being very competitive on attracting businesses to come set up in their specific regions. But that just gives you a bit of a spectrum of these businesses need to reflect on which of these regions will be best fit for them. The other big dynamic or challenge is the demographics again, in terms of just if you look at the landscape around demographics. You've got a very diverse culture. You've got about 200 different nationalities operating in the UAE. And each of these dynamics as an entrepreneurial enterprise You need to reflect on how you look at visa regulations, HR policies, and how you ultimately govern this diverse spectrum of cultures. And I guess the final challenge that we deem is quite critical, and we give advice to CEOs and board members on a daily basis, is you need to rethink your way of working capital management. The region still requires significant cash flow to operate. And that's a combination of the fact that it's so competitive, and you need to rethink about how you look at your product in terms of differentiation and relevancy. But ultimately, when you start operating the business, cash flow management is fundamental. And this is mainly because of debtors. You still see a lot of exorbitant debtors days, and the payment life cycle is still something that needs a lot of optimization in the region. So a lot of companies need to have access to credit. They need to have access to capital structure where they have OPEX models to allow them to truly operate the business. I guess those are not unique challenges, but they are in some way amplified in the region. And we find a lot of CEOs, entrepreneurs navigating those extremely well.
So in terms of operating capital, what do you recommend to incoming businesses?
Well, look, it depends on industry, it depends on the nature of business, but fundamentally, we see that the financial system requires a lot of diligence from entrepreneurs or shareholders when they set up in the UAE. So you need to have access to the right levels of credit, and more importantly, you need to have access to the right type of operations to manage your working capital, especially around the debtors days and the commercial businesses that you do. Now, look, that's also changing. I guess it depends the nature of the business, because we see in the digital businesses we spoke about earlier, they don't necessarily have, certain goods or certain services that are delivered in a milestone fashion that potentially change the risk profile of these businesses. The new businesses, the unicorns that we're seeing in the region, those businesses are software developed and software delivered, and they really optimized for digital services. And those, obviously, with the type of business models that they introduce, a lot of these challenges that we've spoken about in terms of working capital, those things are in some way de-risked.
Loan facilities, the ability to be able to have access to capital that will allow you to grow. What is Dubai, or let's extend to the UAE's policy in terms of credit facilities to foreign-owned or foreign-managed entities?
Well, this is where there's been significant reform as well. As the corporate law has been changing and keeping up with modern times, we've also seen the financial system taking a reboot, and it's been one of the largest barriers in the region has been the financial system, the ability to set up a credit facility, the ability to get the type of credit controls in the region for enterprises to operate. And I guess you see an influx of, first of all, global banks setting up in the likes of the UAE, especially in the financial centers that we've now established in the UAE as well. And these global banks, with the main support of local banks, are changing their credit offerings into the region. So you're seeing, I would say, before all the macro developments that we have now currently in the world, in the global landscape, before that, you saw a larger and a bigger ecosystem around credit, and especially how companies can ultimately get into loan facilities in the region.
Now, we've touched on quite a few different points, but it very much paints a picture of an enabling environment for entrepreneurs, for business owners. I'd like to know, though, what are some of the common mistakes that South African business owners make when coming into the UAE?
Well, common mistakes is once again that planning for short-term versus long-term. So, you need to be, from a shareholder and from a board perspective, you need to be able to think about the short-term and the long-term in terms of operating in the UAE and using the UAE as a beachhead potentially into the rest of the GCC or Middle East countries and also into Africa. I guess some of the big challenges can relate to the business culture. Can also relate in terms of the type of competition that you see in these markets. For example, in the UAE, you're mainly operating in a global market. 90% of the businesses in Dubai are small, medium enterprises. They create 40% of the jobs. But these small and medium enterprises are very lean. They are very competitive, and they are able to turn around and be very innovative. So if you are a incumbent coming from South Africa or any other global market into the likes of the UAE, and your main target market is going to be Dubai, you need to understand some of the key market forces and some of the differentiating forces that you need to ultimately transcend to create a sustainable business. And I would summarize those as it's a very competitive market. Typically, a lot of enterprises underestimate how competitive it is. There is a very cultural diverse market. So if you think about reaching the consumer, you need to reflect on your cost of acquisition of the client. That's probably exorbitant in Dubai in many times. So you need to reflect on that value chain as well. And then finally, the big mistakes is really around how you ultimately think about operating the business to some of the financial instruments you need and some of the risk factors that you need to transcend.
And I mean, the fact that it's 90% SMEs operating, I didn't know that. That's quite surprising to me, because I guess the perception is that you think Dubai, you think the Emirates, you're thinking, big business, you're thinking multinationals, but understanding that it's 90% small businesses is quite surprising. I'd be quite curious to hear from you. What are some of the other uncommon, surprising, let's say, benefits to operating in Dubai?
I think when we speak to CEOs, and especially some of these businesses that are operating, they're always surprised about the leadership and the vision of the region. It is a reoccurring theme. If you look at the next 50 years of the UAE, there's 10 principles that the Supreme Committee and ultimately the Executive Committee and the whole government galvanizes around. And that means that you have a country that's fundamentally focused on those 10 principles. And as a consequence, you have the business community and the social community ultimately clustering around these principles. And I guess I find entrepreneurs and CEOs very surprised how that bold leadership is helping their businesses to ultimately succeed and pioneer in this market. I guess the other surprising factor is, if you double click on that a bit more, the programs and initiatives that the government ultimately puts in to help SMEs and enterprises to succeed. So you'll see a lot of increase in terms of private-public partnerships, where the government is essentially looking at the private sector to enhance their ultimate service delivery to the citizens. So it's a big bet that private sector needs to be a catalyst to the solution that's required for the next 50 years in the UAE to continue to be relevant and differentiated in this global market. And I guess also the CEOs are always surprised around the storytelling. The UAE is rich in culture, rich in terms of what has transpired the last 5 decades, the stories that come with it. And as CEOs start operating in the region, start succeeding in the region, they always look back. And I guess they see how these stories and these narratives help them ultimately to shape the businesses that they have and the value creation that they ultimately have delivered.
Great. So in closing, I'd like to get your top tips for businesses wishing to enter the market.
Well, the top tips, depending if you're B2B or B2C, we touched on some of them already, but I would say if you are thinking about B2C type of markets, you need to understand that in UAE, we've got very digitally connected consumers. You've got one of the highest proliferations of internet connectivity across the region and across the world here in the UAE. So more than 96% of people are connected using their mobiles to acquire service, to buy services, and to interact with your business. So you really need to understand that client journey. You need to understand the cost of acquisition of those clients, because ultimately that impacts your margin structure of how you operate the business. If you're more in the B2B sector, I guess the main takeaway there is you need to think about the target operating model and the target market across how you would leverage the UAE to interact into other regions, how you would expose your business to those regions, and some of the fundamental mechanisms that we spoke about in terms of how you think about credit facilities, working capital management, and really driving a lean business. Over and above that, use the mechanisms and all the models that are available There's a lot of company formation models available. You've got a lot of companies that are making their existence on helping key companies set up in the UAE. And then you've got the likes of South African Business Council with Dubai Chambers. These type of institutions are fundamentally there to facilitate and accelerate businesses to operate in the region. And these institutions, we get up each day caring about how can we help entrepreneurs and enterprises to be more successful by interlocking into the right programs, getting access to the right supply chain or value chains in the region, and ultimately, getting access to the right type of networks to scale the business. So, I guess it's a combination of all those components that will be top tips. Because if you do those right, you should de-risk yourself and ultimately be able to see some growth.
Okay, that's pretty good. I'm gonna sneak in a last tiny question. You mentioned earlier new corporate vehicles. Which one is the most exciting for you, and what type of business would best benefit from it? Very briefly.
Well, if you look at these new corporate vehicles coming in, I think there's a lot of excitement around the SPAC community. So these SPACs allows for a different level of acquisition and allows for a different level of investment model. And traditionally, the only way that private capital could get access to these type of investment opportunities was through the public markets. So you needed to be either investor going into public markets or being able, as an institution, to get access to some level of investment through an IPO. A SPAC allows the investors and really the man on the street to have access to a different investment model. And this really brings for me fold on two matters. You're seeing more investment coming into the region, so more capital allocators are interested in how they can get access into these SPAC organizations and get access to these models in the region. And then that access brings in essentially more capital allocation. So those two components, I guess, is very exciting in the region. There's already a lot of success in there, and watch this space because we're going into the season where a lot more of national companies are going into IPOs and are going into SPAC models. So that's an exciting space to look at.
I am so glad that I asked that question. Paul, thank you so much for joining us today and for sharing your tips and insights about South African companies and how they can best leverage the opportunity that Dubai and the UAE offers. That was my guest, Paul Potgieter, Chairman of the South African Business Council in Dubai. Until next time, it's goodbye for now.